Many months ago, I got a request from a viewer to explain the differences between the grammar that native Japanese speakers are taught at school and the grammar that learners of Japanese study. So, in today's video, I want to talk about two main differences between them. For the rest of the video, I will be referring to the former type of grammar as L1 grammar and the latter as L2 grammar for the sake of brevity, but bear in mind that these terms have vastly different definitions in the language acquisition literature. What is taught as part of grammar? For learners of Japanese, the purpose of studying grammar is to acquire the rules that are necessary for understanding how to use words and phrases correctly, as well as how to form correct sentences. In other words, without studying grammar, you cannot speak Japanese, at least not well enough to be perceived passable. On the other hand, when native speakers of Japanese are first introduced to the study of grammar at school, they already possess the ability to comprehend and produce the language. This fundamental difference has implications on what is taught as part of grammatical education. In short, L1 grammar focuses on abstract, theoretical knowledge that facilitates metalinguistic analyses, while L2 grammar aims to impart specific, practical knowledge that underpins communication. In order to establish how grammar is defined officially in L1 grammar, I looked at the guidelines for courses of study for middle schools issued by the Ministry of Education. However, the word bunpo or grammar occurred only 9 times within the 207-page document. Nevertheless, the document contained a section called bunto bunsho, meaning sentences and passages. The document dictates in this section that the following components should be taught. 1. Classification of words. 2. Conjugations of words. 3. The functions of particles and auxiliary verbs. 4. The structure of a sentence, including the order and correspondence of sentential elements. 5. The functions of deictic phrases and conjunctive phrases. 6. The structures and development of stories and passages. And 7. The types of stories and passages and their characteristics. The 6th and 7th components wouldn't normally be classified as part of grammar, so I will ignore these two. The document also prescribes that some other aspects of the Japanese language be taught, such as kanji, vocabulary, keigo, and literary devices, but these are listed under different sections, which indicates to me that they are not considered to be part of grammar. Let's go over the 5 components of L1 grammar in a little more detail. 1. Students learn how to classify words into categories, such as nouns, verbs, and adjectives. The aim here is not to teach them how to use these words, but to teach them the labels by which to call them, which will help them look at language more analytically. 2. Students learn how verbs and adjectives change forms. Again, they already possess an implicit knowledge of how to conjugate words, so the aim is to teach them that there are patterns and rules that can be formulated explicitly. 3. Students learn the labels and the different uses of particles and auxiliary verbs for the same reason as above. 4. The phrase "the structure of a sentence" here suggests that students learn important grammatical concepts such as subjects, predicates, and modifiers so that they can analyze the constituents of a sentence. 5. Deictic phrases are essentially phrases that point to something, such as kore, sore, and are, while conjunctive phrases connect words, phrases, and sentences together, and this is about the full extent of the grammatical education that students in Japan receive. Now, let's shift our focus to L2 grammar. The 5 components of grammar that I've just mentioned are all taught in L2 grammar as well, but the main difference is that you learn not just the concepts and labels, but also how to use them in a sentence. For instance, when you are first introduced to the Japanese language, you may not even know the fact that its deictic system has a 3-way distinction: the proximal, the medial, and the distal. This concept may take some getting used to, especially if your native language makes a 2-way distinction, like English does. It is only after fully grasping this concept that you can master their appropriate use. Native Japanese speakers, on the other hand, already have an intuitive understanding of the 3-way system when they start going to school, and they are likely able to use them correctly in sentences. In addition, you as a learner study very specific phrases and constructions that are not included in L1 textbooks. For example, Tae Kim's Japanese Grammar Guide, a popular L2 textbook, teaches how to use constructions like 何々ます, 何々ている, and 何々ています, as well as particles like ka, ne, yo, ni, and e. Again, native speakers already know what they mean and how to use them intuitively, so the formal education only serves to provide them with an explicit understanding of what they are and a theoretical framework by which to identify and analyze them. Number 2. Terminological differences. When you compare L1 and L2 grammar textbooks, you will notice that they use different grammatical terms. This is because L1 grammar is based predominantly on the linguistic theory proposed by Hashimoto Shinkichi, an influential Japanese language scholar from the pre-World War II era. In fact, his ideas have been so influential that Japanese kids today are still taught his theory that is nearly a century old. So you see that it's not just English education that is in dire need of revision in this country, but language education in general, but I digress. Here are some of the most notable differences in terminology. Firstly, native speakers are taught that there are keiyoshi, which are often translated as adjectives, and keiyodoshi, which literally means adjectival verbs, whereas most learners of Japanese know them by the terms i adjectives and na adjectives, respectively. The peculiar term keiyodoshi got its name from the fact that each keiyodoshi contains one of the following verbs at the end: da, nari, tari, and desu. Another terminological difference relates to the grammatical category of fukushi or adverbs. In L2 grammar, adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, other adverbs, as well as clauses and sentences. According to L1 grammar, however, while fukushi still modify verbs, adjectives, and adjectival verbs, there's one crucial difference, which is that they don't conjugate, nor are they derived from adjectives through inflection. Let me explain this using a simple example. In L2 grammar, you are taught that the i adjective hayai, quick, can inflect and be turned into the adverb hayaku, quickly. In L1 grammar, on the other hand, both hayai and hayaku are classified as a keiyoshi. That is, they are regarded as different forms of the same adjective. Hayai is said to be either in the shushikei form or in the rentaikei form, while hayaku is in the renyokei form. Then what does a fukushi or an adverb look like in L1 grammar? One example that I'm sure you're all familiar with is the word totemo or very. Totemo mainly modifies adjectives. For example, totemo hayai means very fast. Totemo also satisfies the second criterion for being a fukushi. That is, it doesn't conjugate, and it is not derived from another word through inflection. Now, how about verbs? Verbs are also taught very differently between L1 and L2 grammars, and I want to focus on two differences in particular. 1. Verb types, and 2. Inflectional forms. First, according to many L2 grammar textbooks, there are said to be 3 types of verbs in Japanese: u verbs, ru verbs, and irregular verbs. Some textbooks may refer to them instead as Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 verbs, respectively. On the other hand, L1 grammar posits 5 types of verbs based on conjugation patterns, namely godan katsuyo, kami ichidan katsuyo, shimo ichidan katsuyo, kagyo henkaku katsuyo, and sagyo henkaku katsuyo. Japanese kids are taught that to tell which category a given verb belongs to, you first need to take the negative form or the nai form of the verb and then look at the vowel just before nai. If the vowel is a, then it is a godan katsuyo verb. If the vowel is i, then kami ichidan katsuyo. And if the vowel is e, then shimo ichidan katsuyo. Kagyo henkaku katsuyo and sagyo henkaku katsuyo are reserved for the irregular verbs or any compound verbs that derives from them. Second, L1 and L2 grammar textbooks also differ significantly in how they teach verbal inflections. In L2 grammar, you are taught that Japanese verbs have about a dozen inflectional forms. For example, in the popular L2 textbook series, Genki, you are introduced to 12 inflectional forms: the dictionary form, the long form or the masu form, the te form, the short past form or the ta form, the short present negative form, the short past negative form, the potential form, the volitional form, the ba form, the passive form, the causative form, and finally, the causative passive form. In contrast, the number of inflectional forms taught in L1 grammar is only 6. They are 未然形、連用形、終止形、連体形、仮定形, and 命令形. To be able to memorize and identify these forms, students are taught what tends to appear after each of them. 未然形 before ない and う、連用形 before ます and た、終止形 at the end of a sentence, 連体形 before 時、仮定形 before 場 and 命令形 when giving a command. The reason why the inflectional system in L1 grammar is so minimalistic boils down to the different notion of what counts as inflectional suffixes in L1 grammar. Unlike in L2 grammar, where bound morphemes like seru and rareru are considered to be inflectional suffixes, L1 grammar treats them as auxiliary verbs. Take the example of the verb 食べる to eat. According to L1 grammar, this verb conjugates as follows: 食べ、食べ、食べる、食べる、食べれ、食べろ. Within this paradigm, many of the inflectional forms postulated in L2 grammar can be subsumed under the 連用形 form, with 連用形 being the form that connects a verb with 要件, which is the umbrella term encompassing 動詞、形容詞 and 形容動詞. For instance, 食べます、食べて and 食べた can all be interpreted to be the 連用形 form of the verb 食べる, combined with different auxiliary verbs and particles such as ます、て and た. But hang on, didn't I state just a moment ago that 連用形 links a verb with either a verb, an adjective, or an adjectival verb? So why does it also allow the verb to attach itself to auxiliary verbs and particles? And when does a verb ever get attached to another verb directly? If you had these questions, you understand what's wrong with this paradigm. Another problem is that 語段活用 verbs such as 書く to write have two different 連用形 forms. Earlier, I stated that students learn that 連用形 appears before ます and た. However, 書く becomes 書き before ます while becoming 書い before た. 語段活用 verbs also bifurcate in 未然形. Students are taught that 未然形 appears before ない and う but 書く before ない is 書か and 書く before う is 書こ. Even worse, the irregular verb する has three different 未然形 forms: し、ない、せ、ぬ and される. At this point, it's obvious that the L1 grammarians who conceived this theory more than a century ago tried to keep their inflectional system simplistic, but they ended up with this confusing mess of a system. This is the end of this video. If you have noticed any other differences between L1 and L2 grammars, please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.